Hey, welcome back to the next lesson of our tutorial series on how to use the cross-platform native plugins 2 inside Unity. For this lesson, I'll show you how to create an in-app store using the billing services. Now, this lesson is officially sponsored by Voxelbusters, who are the developers of the cross-platform native plugins. So make sure that you check out their content, which I've linked to in the description below. Here in the Overview tab of the documentation for billing services, we get a short description of what this feature is for, and that is it gives us access to use in-app purchases for both iOS and Android with a unified API. And so this is super exciting because by the end of this video, you'll have a working in-app store that you can implement into any of your Unity projects. But let's move on to the next section, which is use cases. On this page, it gives us two examples or use cases. The first is selling virtual goods. This could be anything from a virtual currency like coins and gems to selling weapons, cosmetics, and power-ups. The other use case is the option to remove ads. If you want to make money through a mobile game that you've published, this is probably the simplest way to monetize that game. Now, I'm sure there's more use cases that you can think of for implementing a billing service into your app, but these are definitely the most common that can be found in pretty much every popular mobile game out there. The first setup that we have to do for billing services is within Unity. Now once again, you want to make sure that the billing services is enabled, and then you can expand it. We can then also expand the product settings, and here you'll notice that the product settings is an array of a product class. And so the first thing that you'll want to do is determine how many products you want to have in your game. You can then set your products array to that size. And so here you can see that I have 5 instances of the product class. You then need to go through each product in this array and set the ID, the platform ID overrides if they're different for each platform. If they're not different, then you can just leave these fields blank. Then set the product type, the title, and description. But let me explain in further detail what each of these options are. The ID field is for how you want to reference each product within Unity and your scripts. The platform ID is more of a back end and are more for how the billing services communicate with the different platforms. And so the platform ID, and more specifically the platform ID overrides, need to match the ID of each in-app purchase on their given platform. For product type, there's two different options. There's consumable and non-consumable. A consumable product is like a virtual currency or an item that has limited use within your game, such as a power-up or a med kit. A non-consumable is used for products that are bound to your player and do not expire. This includes allowing the player to remove ads, as well as weapons and cosmetics. The title and description fields can be used to populate each product listing in your store. For my project, I'll go ahead and create a remove ads product. So my ID can just be remove_ads. I'll then type in the reverse domain name for the platform IDs. And I'll change the product type to non-consumable. I can then fill in a title, remove ads, and a description. And so once you've set these options for each product in this array, we can go on to the next section of the documentation, and that is on the setup that we need to do for iOS. To set up our in-app purchases on iOS, we first need to go to iTunes Connect and log into our dashboard. We can then click on My Apps and click on the app that we are working on. Then on the left-hand side under in-app purchases, we want to click on Manage. From here we can then click the plus sign next to in-app purchases. This will bring up a window where you can select the product type of our first in-app purchase. Since I'm creating a remove ads option, I'll click non-consumable and then click create. Here we then need to fill out this form for each product. So for the reference name, I'll type remove ads. For the product ID, I'll paste in the same reverse domain name. We then need to set the pricing, so I'll use the drop-down menu to select something like $2, maybe $3. And finally, we at least need to type in one localization display name and description. And if you want to, you can paste in the title and description from Unity. But you need to make sure that it's not too long. Once you've done this, we can click Save, and then we can go back to Manage and add in the rest of our products. The last part of the documentation for the iOS setup explains that your in-app purchases won't become active until you've submitted a build of your game that includes the metadata for each product. And once your game is ready to be submitted for review, you'll need to select each product in the in-app purchase section when you have your current app version selected. We'll now go through the settings in order to get in-app purchases working for Android. To do this, you're going to already need to be a developer for Google Play, after which you'll need to log into your Google Play console. Now we're going to assume that you already have an app created, but if you don't, go ahead and create one now. We then want to select the app that we're currently working on, after which we can scroll down in the left-hand column to monetization and select in-app products. Here it says before we can access in-app products, we need to upload at least one APK with billing permissions. And so we can go back to Unity and go through the regular process to sign, build, and upload our APK. Once you've finished uploading your APK, you can then go back to in-app products. And here you can see that it now allows us to add new products. We can then click on Create Product and then fill out this form for each of our products, making sure that the product ID matches what we have in Unity. I'll then fill out the rest of this form for my Remove Ads example. And finally, I can click Save and then Activate. The last thing that we need to do for the Android setup is select Monetization Setup. We then want to copy this licensing key. We'll then go back to Unity, and under Android Properties, we'll paste it into the public key field. Now that we're done with the setup for iOS and Android, let's go through the usage section to create the script we need for our in-app store. Here I have a C# script, which I've called IG_billing. IG is for InfoGamer. And once you have the script created, let's open it up. First thing that we need to do inside this script is add 3 namespaces. The first is using UnityEngine.ui. The second is using voxelbusters.essentialkit. And the third is using voxelbuster.core_library. Next, I have 3 variables inside the script. They're all serialized fields. The first is a button, which I've called Open Store Button. The second is a game object, which I've called Store Panel. And the third is a button which I've made an array called Purchase Buttons. Once you have these variables created, we'll jump over to the documentation. Now the first thing that you find within the documentation is that before we do anything within our script, we want to check to make sure that the billing service is enabled. And that is done with this isAvailable function. So we can copy this line of code and go back to our script. Here in our script, I've added this function to our start function, and I've placed it within the conditions of an if statement. This is because the isAvailable function returns a bool value. Now if this if statement is true, then we can make our open store button interactable. So I have open store button.interactable equals true. The next line of code we'll cover in a second, but from here we want to jump back to the documentation. The next section in the documentation is about events, and there's 3 special events related to the billing service that we need to register to. These events are onInitializeStoreComplete, which is triggered when products are fetched from the store, onTransactionStateChange, which is triggered when there's a change in the state of an ongoing transaction, and finally there's onRestorePurchaseComplete, which is triggered once restored products are available. Now we simply want to add this onEnable and onDisable function to our script. And so I'll copy these lines of code and go back to our script. And here you can see that I've pasted them in below our start function. Now at this point in time, you might be receiving an error for each of these lines of code, and that's because we haven't created the functions that we're registering to the events. And so we'll fix these errors as we create these functions. But from here, let's go back to the documentation, and you'll notice that the next section is on getting billing product details, or in other words, initializing our store. This is done with the initializeStore function. So we can copy this line of code and go back to our script. This line of code I've added into our if statement that we created earlier within the start function. Now this function will initialize our store and get all the product details from the Essential Kit settings. And calling this function triggers our first event. And so we need to create the registered function. For this, we'll go back to the documentation, and here we can find the onInitializeStoreComplete function. So we'll copy this function and go back to our script. I've then pasted this function in below our onDisable function, and inside this function you'll notice that there's 3 parts. There's an if statement where we're checking to see if the error parameter is null, which is good because if we're getting no errors, then we don't have any problems. There's then an else statement for if we are getting errors, and then there's another if statement where we're checking to see how many invalid products we have. Now for the most part, we don't need to mess too much with what's inside this function. But we do need to add one line of code to our first if statement because that's the successful path. Inside this if statement, you'll notice that we have a for loop where we're looking at each product in our products array. This is where we want to add our one line of code. But before we do that, let's hop back over to the documentation. Inside the documentation, the next section is on making a purchase. But before we make a purchase, we need to check to see if that's okay, or in other words, that we haven't already purchased a product. This is done with the can-make-payments function and the isProductPurchased function. And we're going to use this function first. So I'll copy the isProductPurchase function, and then we'll go back to our script. Inside our script, we want to enable the purchase button for each product listing if that product has not already been purchased. And so inside the for loop, I've added the line purchase buttons, square brackets, iter, which is what our for loop is using to iterate through the products array, dot interactable equals exclamation mark because we want to flip the value. I've then pasted in billing services dot is product purchased, and for the parameter, I'm passing in products, square brackets, iter. This will simply take the current product that we're looking at in our for loop and check to see if it is purchased. If it is purchased because of the exclamation mark, the purchase button at the same index will be disabled, and if it hasn't been purchased, it'll be enabled. And so at this point, we have our store and we have our product listings enabled or disabled if the product is available. And so now we can work on making a purchase. And for this, we want to create a public function that we can set to the onClick of our purchase buttons. And so below our uninitialized store complete function, I've created a public void function called purchase, which has a parameter of type int called product index. And then inside this function, I have an if statement where we're calling billing services.canMakePayments, which is this other function that we talked about in the documentation. The next part in the documentation is on how you initialize a transaction, which is done with the byProducts function. So we can copy this line of code and go back to our script. Here you can see that I've pasted this line of code inside our if statement, but I've changed the parameter to billing services.products, square brackets, and then I'm passing in product index, which is the parameter of our function. Now by calling the byProduct function, the billing services will take over and instigate the native process of your current platform to complete the transaction of the in-app purchase. And once the transaction service is complete, whether successfully or not, the billing services will then trigger our second event, which is onTransactionStateChange. And so let's go over to the documentation to get our next registered function, which you can see right here. So we'll copy this and go back to our script. I've then pasted this function in below our purchase function. And inside this function, you'll notice first that we have a for loop where we're for looping through all the transactions that were made during the native process. Most of the time, this is just going to be 1. And then inside this for loop, we have a switch statement where we're checking to see if the transaction was successful or not. If the transaction state is purchased, then it was successful. And this is where we want to add some code. One thing that we need to do, even if the transaction was successful, is verify the receipt. This is done with an if statement where I'm checking to see if our current transaction receipt verification state equals billing receipt verification state success. This helps to mitigate fraudulent transactions. Then inside this if statement, I'm calling a function that we need to create, which is called reward purchase. I'm then passing in the current transaction payment product ID. Once you've done this, we can then go ahead and create this reward purchase function, which I've added to the bottom of our script so it's easier to find. This is a void function called reward purchase, and it has a parameter of type string called product ID. Inside this function, I've added another switch statement where we're checking the value of our parameter, product ID. Inside the switch statement, we need to create a case for each product in our products array. So I have one case with product ID remove ads. For this case, I have a debug statement where I'm outputting the string reward product and saved cloud. I then have a line of code where I'm disabling the purchase button for this product. So I have purchase button, square brackets, 0, because 0 is the index for this product, .interactable equals false. Now, of course, we would want to replace this debug statement with something a little more tangible. For example, when a player purchases my remove ads product, I could change a bool variable that I would then use to check to see if the player has purchased remove ads. If they haven't, I would continue playing ads, but if they have, I would stop showing them ads. I then also have a way to save that bool variable to the cloud, and so when the player comes back to my game, that value is persistent and they still won't be shown any ads. Now there's one more thing that we need to do in the script, so we'll go back to the documentation. The next section in the documentation is on getting previous purchases or restore purchases. Now this doesn't mean refund purchases. This means if a player has purchased a product but it's not showing up, they can press a button and it should give it back to them. This is done by calling the restore purchases function. So you can copy this line of code. We'll go back to our script. Inside our script, I've created a public void function called restore, and I've simply pasted in the line of code. This function is going to be set to the on-click of a UI button. Now by calling the restore purchases function, we're triggering the third and final event, which is on restore purchases complete. And at this point, we need to create this last registered function. And so we'll go back to the documentation, and here's that function. So we'll copy it and go back to our script. And here I've pasted in after our restore function. Now this function is similar to when we first initialize our store, only rather than giving us all the products, it gives us only the products that have already been purchased. And so here inside the for loop, I have another if statement where we're checking to see if transaction.receipt verification state equals billing receipt verification state.success. Inside this if statement, we're calling the same reward purchase function and passing in transition.payment.productID. Now there's one last small thing that we need to add to this script, and that is a public void function which I've called toggle store. Inside this function we have store panel.setActive, and I'm passing in store panel.activeInHierarchy. This function is for toggling on and off our store panel. Once you have this function, we can save our script and go back to Unity. To create our in-app store, we're going to start with a UI canvas. You can create this by right-clicking in the hierarchy, going down to UI and selecting canvas. I've then renamed this object to be store UI, and the only thing that we need to do is attach our IG billing script to this object. Next, we need to create two child objects. The first is a UI button, which I've called open store button. I've then repositioned and sized this button so that it's down in the bottom right corner of our canvas, and I've changed the text object of this button to say store. And we need to add an on-click event where we'll drag in our IG billing script from our store UI and then use the drop-down menu to go to IG billing and select toggle store. We can then disable the interactable option for this button, after which we need to create our second child object, which is a UI panel. You can create this object by right-clicking on your canvas, going down to UI and selecting panel. I've then renamed this object to store panel, and I've changed the image color to be a dark gray. Now there's a number of child objects to our panel. The first is a text object, which is our title for this panel, and it just says store. We then have a scroll view, which can be made by creating another UI panel, which you'll then want to resize so it's not so big as your first panel, and you'll want to add a scroll rect component. We then have the content for our scroll rect, which is another UI panel, only this one is stretched beyond the perimeter of our canvas. This content object also has a horizontal layout group with all the padding and spacing set to 5, the child alignment set to middle left, the control child size, and child force expand only have height enabled. Once you create this content object, you'll want to go back to your scroll view and drag the content object into the content field of the scroll rect. I've then also disabled the vertical movement of our scroll rect. This makes it so our content object can move side to side in play mode. Now we do have a prefab object that's a child to our content, but we'll skip over this for now and go on to this restore purchase button. This is just another UI button that I've positioned and anchored to the top left corner of our canvas, and I've changed the text child object to read restore purchases. We then need to add an on-click event for this button, so we'll drag in our store UI and then use the drop-down menu to select IG billing and then restore. We then have one more button, which I've called close, and this I've anchored to the top right corner of our canvas, and I've changed the text child object to be a capital X. We'll add an on-click event to this button by dragging in our store UI, then use the drop-down menu to select IG billing and toggle store. Now let's take a look at the prefab object, which is a child to our content. This prefab will be used for displaying each product. You can start with a UI image, and I've set the width to 250. The rest of the rect transform should be handled by the horizontal layout group that's on our parent content object. I've then added an outline component. As child to this prefab object, we have a text object, which is called name. We then have a UI image, which will be for displaying a thumbnail image of the product. We then have another text object, which is for the description of the product. We then have a UI button, which will be used for displaying the price of the product and purchasing the product. Once you've created this product listing, you can then make a prefab out of it by dragging it into your project window. You can then add in an instance of this prefab for each product in your products list. And thanks to the horizontal layout group, these prefabs are automatically positioned and spaced on our content object. Once you have enough product listings added to your content object, we then need to expand each product listing and select the purchase button. And for each purchase button, we need to add an on-click event. So we'll drag in the store UI, then use the drop-down menu to select IG billing and then purchase. We then need to set the parameter of each button to be the corresponding index of the product we want this button to purchase. You also need to set the name, the image, the description, and have the purchase button display the correct price of the product. And so I can set the first product listing to be my remove ads. The last thing that we need to do before we can test our project is set the values of our IG billing script. The first variable is our open store button. The second is our store panel. And then for the purchase buttons array, we need to set it to each purchase button from our store listings. To test this feature, I'm going to click play in the Unity editor. Here you can see that our open store button has been enabled, and this is due to the billing services is available check. I can then click this button, which will enable our store panel. We've got our horizontal layout group and our scroll view, and if I were to click on the purchase button for the remove ads product, you can see a new panel open that says confirm your purchase with a cancel and OK button. Now this panel is only for while you're working in the Unity editor. Once you build your game for Android or iOS, it'll be a native window that asks you to confirm the purchase at this point. So I can click OK, and now here in the console there's a few new log messages. One says buy product with ID remove ads finished successfully, and the other is my log statement that says reward the player with something and cloud save the change. We then have the restore purchase button, which logs which products we've already purchased, and then we have the close button, which disables the store panel. Now there's more things that you can do for testing your in-app store on the two platforms, but I will refer you to the testing section of the documentation for more information. Now that's everything that we're going to cover in this lesson on how to create an in-app store using the billing services. If you enjoyed this lesson, please give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below, and subscribe to our channel so you can be up to date with all our latest videos.